In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces closed in on the final burning remnants of Nazi Germany, the bloodiest conflict in human history was drawing to a close. But amidst the rubble of a collapsed empire, a new and highly secretive race was already beginning. This was not a traditional military campaign for territory or resources. It was a desperate, clandestine hunt for the minds that had engineered the Third Reich's most terrifying arsenal. As American and Soviet troops converged on Berlin, military intelligence realized that the true spoils of this war were not gold or art, but the lethal technological supremacy developed by German scientists. The United States government was simultaneously impressed and deeply terrified by what the German war machine had achieved. Throughout the conflict, Allied commanders had braced themselves for the deployment of Wunderwaffen, Hitler's so-called wonder weapons, and their fears were justified. The Germans had successfully deployed the V-1 cruise missile and the V-2 ballistic rocket, a weapon of unfathomable precision and speed that dropped from the edge of space without a sound, obliterating city blocks in London and Antwerp. Beyond rocketry, American forces uncovered hidden caches of experimental nerve agents and horrifying biological programs aimed at weaponizing the bubonic plague. Washington knew that whoever controlled the architects of these weapons would dictate the global balance of power for the next century. But finding them in a collapsed state was an organizational nightmare. The critical breakthrough happened as Allied troops advanced on Bonn University. In a state of sheer panic, German officials had desperately attempted to destroy a master intelligence document curated by engineer Werner Ozenberg, a meticulously detailed roster of 15,000 top-tier scientists and technicians essential to the Nazi war effort. They tore the files apart and attempted to flush them down a toilet. Those almost destroyed documents were recovered by American intelligence. The Ozenberg list became the ultimate shopping catalog for the Pentagon. Under strict operational secrecy, the United States launched a covert extraction mission aimed at capturing the absolute best of these scientific minds, actively denying them to the advancing Soviet Union. Ultimately, they would quietly smuggle over 1,500 German and Austrian experts onto American soil. But to harness their genius, the world's greatest democracy would have to forge a pact with the devil. The operation was originally codenamed Project Overcast. The official objective drafted by the military was highly restricted: bring these German experts to the United States on temporary 6-month contracts to help finish the grinding war in the Pacific against Japan. But in August 1945, the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war abruptly ended. The original justification for using enemy scientists vanished overnight. Yet, the scientists were not sent back to Europe. Behind closed doors, the geopolitical landscape was shifting rapidly. The newly formed Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency recognized that the fragile alliance with the Soviet Union was already fracturing. The Cold War had begun, and the threat of global annihilation loomed larger than ever. To the American military, maintaining technological dominance over the communists was an existential necessity. If the United States didn't secure these brilliant engineers, the Soviets absolutely would. But the intelligence agencies faced a massive legal and public relations catastrophe. Roughly half of the targeted specialists had formal records with the Nazi Party. Many were not just opportunistic members, they were true believers who had actively joined the SA Brownshirts, and some were ranking officers in the SS, the most fanatical and ruthless paramilitary organization of the Third Reich. Officially, the United States government had strict policies forbidding the recruitment of anyone sympathetic to the Nazi cause. To bypass their own government's rules, military recruiters devised a chillingly simple system. They placed ordinary paperclips at the top of the security dossiers for the scientists they deemed indispensable. That small piece of bent metal was a silent, prearranged signal to federal investigators. It fundamentally meant, do not look too closely. This man is one of ours. Because of this method, the program was quietly rebranded as Operation Paperclip. Almost overnight, the histories of these men were systematically whitewashed. Dark pasts were classified, SS affiliations were erased, and their public profiles were scrubbed clean. The United States government actively sanitized the biographies of enemy combatants, quietly integrating them into military laboratories, highly guarded government facilities, and the heart of the American defense industry. To truly understand the moral cost of Operation Paperclip, one must look closely at exactly where this coveted technology was born. It wasn't developed in sterile, brightly lit research laboratories. It was forged in places like Mittelwerk, a sprawling subterranean weapons facility violently carved into the solid rock of the Harz Mountains in central Germany. This is where the dreaded V-2 ballistic missile was manufactured, but it was not built by unionized laborers or voluntary factory workers. The assembly line was powered exclusively by enslaved human beings. The conditions inside Mittelwerk were notoriously brutal and devoid of mercy. Starving prisoners from nearby concentration camps were forced to work deep underground, deprived of sunlight and basic sanitation. Those who faltered from exhaustion or were suspected of minor sabotage were publicly executed, often hanged from the very cranes used to assemble the rockets. Among the brilliant masterminds who ran this hellish facility were the exact men who would soon be handed lucrative contracts and a new life in the United States. Men like Georg Ricke, the general manager who personally oversaw the relentless acquisition of enslaved workers. Men like Arthur Rudolph, the chief operations director who managed the grueling rocket production quotas, operating a system where human life was cheaper than the machinery they built. But the most prominent recruit of them all was the charismatic prodigy of German rocketry, Dr. Werner von Braun. To the American military, he was the golden ticket to aerospace supremacy. But in Germany, von Braun was not just a theoretical scientist, he was an active officer in the SS. He possessed an intimate, undeniable knowledge of the horrific atrocities powering his engineering dreams. Historical records indicate von Braun personally visited the Buchenwald concentration camp to handpick the enslaved inmates who would be sent to the underground tunnels to build his rockets. The Pentagon was fully aware of these facts, yet they made a calculated decision that the blood on the rockets was an acceptable price for military dominance. They believed that allowing these intellects to face war crimes, trials at Nuremberg would be a strategic failure. Instead of a hangman's noose, the architects of Hitler's most advanced terror weapons were offered the American dream. The transition for these men was surreal. In an environment completely detached from the ruined continent they left behind, von Braun and a select group of over 100 colleagues were relocated to the desolate military testing grounds of Fort Bliss, Texas. Referencing their strange, highly classified status, the scientists jokingly referred to themselves as prisoners of peace. Eventually, they were moved to the sprawling Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, where the men who had once operated in the dark shadow of the swastika were now attending Rotary clubs, buying American cars, and enjoying backyard barbecues in the Deep South. Throughout the 1950s, the U.S. military relied heavily on von Braun's team to accelerate the development of liquid propellant ballistic missiles for a potential nuclear strike against the Soviets. But in October 1957, a profound shockwave hit Washington. The Soviet Union successfully launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. The terrifying realization that Soviet rockets could reach outer space meant they could also drop nuclear warheads on American cities. The space race was officially ignited. In 1960, von Braun's division was transferred from the Army to a brand new civilian agency known as NASA. What followed was one of the most successful public relations transformations in history. The government aggressively pushed von Braun into the spotlight. He became an outspoken, celebrated advocate for space exploration, making himself a household name through glamorous magazine spreads and primetime appearances on Walt Disney television programs. He was completely rebranded from an enemy weapons designer into an all-American visionary. He was not alone in this redemption. His former SS colleague, Kurt DeBuse, rose through the ranks to become the very first director of the Kennedy Space Center, orchestrating America's most historic launches. Another paperclip recruit, Hubertus Strughold, became a pioneer in aerospace medicine, celebrated as the father of space medicine. It wasn't until after his death that deep scrutiny revealed his earlier role in horrific medical experiments conducted on live concentration camp inmates during the war. This carefully constructed facade culminated on July 20th, 1969. The United States successfully landed a crew of astronauts on the Moon, claiming ultimate victory in the Cold War space race. It was a pinnacle of human achievement. Yet, the towering Saturn V rocket that made it possible was heavily developed, managed, and overseen by the very same minds that had built weapons of terror for the Third Reich. For decades, the public history of the paperclip scientists was fiercely guarded by the federal government. The official narrative was unshakable. They were brilliant, apolitical engineers, entirely disconnected from the ideological horrors of the Nazi regime. The government successfully convinced the public that science was detached from morality. But buried truth eventually bleeds out. In the 1970s and 80s, a new generation of intrepid journalists refused to accept the official story. Slowly, as highly classified intelligence files were finally declassified, the deliberately shoddy vetting process of Operation Paperclip was exposed to the light. The facts could no longer be contained. In the early 1980s, the U.S. Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations quietly began assembling a massive war crimes case against none other than Arthur Rudolph, the man credited with managing the Saturn V lunar rocket project, who was also the ruthless slave master of the Mittelwerk tunnels. It forces humanity to confront a terrifying and uncomfortable question. Is science ever truly apolitical? And how much of our collective soul are we willing to sacrifice in order to secure the future? The Apollo 11 moon landing was proudly declared a giant leap for mankind. But the footprints left in the lunar dust forever carry the heavy hidden weight of history. If you found this breakdown valuable, leave a like and subscribe. Until next time.